So today I wanted to talk about 3 archetypes, linking them together to see how they inform a particular aspect of the imperial cult of the liberal Western regime. But before I do that, I just want to talk briefly about some experiences, some anecdotes that I've had working in the arts. So the first is someone who arrived at art school and they didn't have a very strong or particular artistic voice, but they were incredibly proficient technically. They had a traditional and romantic sensibility. For those who are aware of GCSEs and A-levels in the United Kingdom, they were sort of top of the class. They're the work you would see in the top of a class, a GCSE or A-levels, but they didn't really possess a very strong or particular artistic perspective. Within one term of being at a Russell Group university, their work had completely transformed. It was ugly and it was angular, and it had these sort of performative affectations of high modernism. It was by the numbers, by the book, high modernism with an expressionist sensibility to it. I remember going to see one of their works and seeing this huge, massive, long blurb about Trump and about Brexit that was completely unrelated to their work. Just like they had done at GCSE and A-level, they had done what was expected of them. They found themselves in a new context, so did what was expected of them there. In doing so, they received a huge amount of praise. The second is a visual performance I saw where someone had linked bubble wrap through these close microphones up to a speaker system where the sounds were distorted. The bubble wrap was on a flat table, and they gyrated and broke pieces of bubble wrap in a non-rhythmic and expressive way with their body, and the sounds were distorted into something that was superficially interesting, but the work had no form, it had no structure. It just stopped when all of the bubble wraps were popped. This work seemed to me incredibly indulgent and pointless, but again, it was praised. The last anecdote is one of the most offensive things I've seen. So there was this young white gentleman, and he started singing the first 2 lines of a black spiritual and got the audience to join in. So we're all singing round and round in circles these first 2 lines of a black spiritual. He's doing this highly ornamented black accent with all of these runs and trills in his voice, which I think is, very, very cringe. While we carry on singing this, he ends up shouting. It appears that he's reading off a bit of paper, random names. So he's shouting at the top of his voice, Javier Gomez. He's shouting, Shantice Wilson. He just starts shouting random names. And after each name, he rips up or screws up the bit of paper and throws it in the air. We realize the bits of paper are blank. So he's memorized these names, I guess. And I'm thinking, what is this? What is he doing? This is all very cringe. And then he says, Mike Brown. He says, some other names that we know from the news. And you realize, these are men who have been killed by policemen because they tried to fight policemen and lost. So he's doing some big performance about police brutality, I guess, and we're all singing this black spiritual over it. And he then interrupts the black spiritual with a free jazz drum solo. So those who aren't aware of what free jazz is, it's basically jazz, but with no form and no structure. So it's just the improvisation, but no melody, no chords, no nothing. It's just random. So it sort of looks like, and it basically is, someone just having a spastic attack at the drum kit. No rhythm, no structure, no nothing. And this goes on way, way too long, and it's very awkward. And yet, he's praised for it. But a black friend of mine came up afterwards and apologized to me. I don't know why they apologized to me. I guess they saw me scowling or something. I was trying to hide my emotions though. So, a lot of people, perhaps in private, are willing to admit that these things are cringe, these people are talentless, or not particularly talented, and yet, it gets praised, it gets endorsed, and it gets encouraged. Why is that? Well, to understand that, I want to talk about these three archetypes. Now, the first archetype is related to these anecdotes, and it's children who are not particularly talented, but are groomed by their parents, their middle-class parents, into being artists. And their parents view it as incredibly prestigious for them to be artists. And they have these subsidized careers of indulgence within the arts. Another archetype is that of the jack of all trades, someone who is moderately talented in a disparate number of fields, but is incapable of applying themselves to one to the point of mastery. So kind of lives in a state of limbo, a limbo of mediocrity for their lives. The last one, related to both of these, is the cult of the artist as it arrives from the Enlightenment. So the recasting of the role of an artist, rather from a servant of God, a servant of what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, who is called to a life of service, to bring that truth and goodness and beauty to the world through sacrifice and dedication. Rather, they're kind of a social critic, someone who exists outside of society and thereby doesn't have to play by any of its rules, and who critiques and undermines the society as a completely free and self-actualized individual, and in doing so reveals new ways of being for people, and new forms of freedom for us to indulge in. The thing that relates all three of these is the cult of the self as it arrives from Western liberalism and ultimately from the Enlightenment. In the cult of the self, who are the priests? Well, the priests are artists because of their very special role. So this is why the middle classes often want to groom their children into being priests, who are artists. Whereas these are not like real priests who are called to a life of sacrifice. These people are called to a life of self-indulgence. The second archetype of the jack of all trades, we can see this in Marx. What is it that Marx promises? He promises us that we can be an engineer in the morning, a philosopher in the day, a fisherman in the evening. And that, once we're liberated from all of our obligations, we will have, a Mozart or a Rembrandt on every single street corner. This is just nonsense. Anyone who's lived in reality knows that this is absurd. But what is it here? What is promised to us? It's a state of pure potentiality where we don't have to make the sacrifices that people make where they grow old and mature, where they sacrifice all the options that they have to dedicate themselves to one thing. Instead, you can exist eternally in this state of adolescence. And this is seen as the holiest place to be, a state of pure potentiality where we are liberated from all the obligations of our society, be they economic obligations or more traditional forms of social obligation. And finally, relating to this is the artists themselves as the high priest of the cult of the self. This is why, you go to a contemporary art gallery and just find absolute filth meant to, demean, humiliate and undermine moral norms, cultural norms, your own aesthetic sensibilities, ancient taboos being transgressed. This is a holy act. These acts of defilement against the human soul and against beauty and goodness are holy acts within the cult of the self because they're unlocking new forms of potentiality. Liberalism, with its myriad of consumer identities, makes the promise to us that we can be like these indulged children, that we can be completely free and self-actualized individuals outside of societies, essentially that we can be the artists of our own lives. But like an overbearing or abusive mother, it does not want us to grow up and reject her, to embrace the masculine authority of discipline and tradition. It wants us to remain forever adolescent consumers, unable to make the harsh sacrifices demanded of us to grow up. The cult of the self and liberalism makes the promise to us that we can be anything, but just like Satan's promise in the garden and in the desert, this is a false promise. And all that awaits us is oblivion, is lives of wasted potential and constant distraction. We will live in that limbo of mediocrity that the jack of all trades lives in, a truly living hell. as Indigenous Westerners, it's our job to rid ourselves of this infantile dream that we can be anything we want and become one thing, the only thing we can become, the only thing that is truly needed of ourselves. We must become ourselves.